makes sense to talk about natural disasters, no, or not, no? Um, how do we think about the humanitarian governance and reconstructions and risk and all that, no? When we start from accepting, no, that the idea of natural more or less is not so true. But we have to more or less focus on the distribution of vulnerability, on the distribution of historical legacies and all that, no? So disasters are man-made, are historical made, no? So in that sense, that's why we were so interested of inviting Rod. That I think he hasn't arrived yet, no, to the meeting. I don't know. Well, anyway, we can continue talking, no, because precisely as you know, the Caribbean is a central place for the for modernity. I mean, Caribbean is the place for it all started, no? Thinking about the plantation, thinking about the slave trade and all that, no? So we really want to focus about the Caribbean, and we know that at this moment we are in the hurricane seasons in the Caribbean from May to December, no? And this is precisely why Ron was invited here, no? He is invited here. So basically, these words I just want to say thank you much for being here, no? And why don't we introduce ourselves, try to know who is here before Ron arrives, and then we start with the talk about the Caribbean, how the idea of loosening the dependency of the Ronald here. Hi Ron, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. A little bit flustered, fighting to get into the to the platform.
Okay, thank you much. I'm so happy to be here. So happy to
Right.
be here,
I
Ron.
made it in. Yep.
Good, good. Ron, it's really, I mean, this is a privilege of having Ron here, no? And also having Ron, Rodrigo Mena here, no? So I would just start, so because we don't have much time, no? Just to give you an idea about the type of guests, of people that were here, no? Rona Jackson, in 2020, has been appointed to head the DRR and recovery for building resilience team of the UNDP in Geneva. He is previously the executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency. He has an extensive thing bio. I'm just talking about that. He was also the Director General of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica, a position he held since August 2006. He previously served as the Deputy Director General, the Senior Director of the Preparedness and Operation Division, and as a Regional Coordinator for the Southern Operations. He has been extensively involved in disaster management at the national, regional, and international level in various capacities. At the national level, he lent his expertise to the coordination of the national responses to the impact of Hurricane Charlie, Ivan 2024, Dennis and Emily 2005, Tropical Depression 1616, and subsequently Tropical Storm Nicole 2010, and mostly recently Hurricane Sandy 2012. Mr. Jackson holds a Master of Science degree in Natural Resources Management and Environment Resource Management from the University of the West Indies, and a Bachelor of Science and a BA in Physical Planning and Environmental Resource Development from the University of Technology. He recently achieved a Master's certificate in Monitoring, Evaluation, and Reporting. Ron, it is a pleasure, it's a privilege. We met with Ron a couple of months back in Geneva, no? And I really was struck by his intelligence, by his acute sense of the importance of critical thinking when thinking about disasters and the humanitarian governance, no? So really, I'm looking into a really important discussion that we have here in the Observatory, no? And also, I want to talk a little bit about Rodrigo Mena, no, who's going to be the discussant. He's also like a really important person, no. He's an assistant professor of disaster and humanitarian studies, no, and the deputy director of the Humanitarian Studies Center and coordination of the Safety and Security Research Initiative. With almost 10 years of experience, his focus has been on humanitarian action, disaster, disaster governance, climate change, environmental sociology, in conflict affected and vulnerable areas. He teaches courses covering humanitarian action and disaster risk reduction governance, research methodology, quantitative and mixed methods, research ethics, and research field safety and security. Rodrigo has a PhD in humanitarian action, no? He has received certification from institutions such as United Nations, Red Cross, Centers for Safety and Development, and he is a contributor and also like an organizer of the Observatory of the Humanitarian Observatory of the Latin American and Caribbean Humanitarian Observatory. No? Last but not least, I want to mention that this project has received funding from the ERC and under the European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program and the grant agreement 884139. No, and all we have to mention this. No, so basically, I don't want to talk too much. I just want to again, Ronald Jackson, really thank you for being here. It is an honor, it's a privilege, And also, Rodrigo, thank you very much for being here. I don't know, Rod, if you want to talk a little bit some words, or if we already start to talk about Ron. I don't know, Rod, do you want to mention something, or we just start right away with the conversation?
No, I just want to welcome Ron and everyone here. We have known names or face, or well, known names rather than faces because we only see your names, but we also have unknown names. So it's always nice to welcome new people. And this is also being broadcasted via YouTube. So I know there are more people hearing us that they are not necessarily connected into this call itself. So now, just let's hear from Ron and then let's have an open conversation. We have been sharing on the chat box also about the link to the humanitarian, to the observatory, but also feel free, all of you, to start commenting already about the presentation on the chat and asking questions and so on. So yeah, let's enjoy and let's have a good conversation.
Okay, I just wanted to trigger off the conversation, with the title of the talk. That is actually a provocation, Ronald, it's a provocation. I mean, the title of the talk is, I'm going to tell again, is a provocation. Listen to this. Loosening the dependency on the global humanitarian system, leveraging the regional capacities and capabilities in the Latin American and Caribbean region. So basically, Ron, what are you talking about here? What is this provocation? Why do we need to loosening the grip from the humanitarian system? Let's start for this. Basically, you're a provocator, Come on, tell us a bit about this.
Yeah. No, I mean, certainly, you're quite right. And I'm happy to join you and all the colleagues online to share some thoughts and reflection. And I think, the reason for the provocation really goes back to my time working in the Caribbean and being close to a lot of the emerging practices on disaster risk reduction, which was my entry point into this space, right? And even as I worked at the national level with the national government in trying to strengthen national systems for disaster risk management, and part of that looking at the sort of national humanitarian responses around events that occurred, we recognize that our system came out of the relationships at that time between what was happening in the region with Cuba, Jamaica, and many of the Caribbean territories where, through the impact of natural hazard events, many of the countries sought to find an institutional system to guide how they would begin to respond to these events. And so, many of the countries at the time in the 70s adopted the Cuban model. Now, that model would have had its own, I would say, barriers to how well it was adapted in sort of Caribbean context, right? If we recall Cuba and what was the sort of governance arrangements around Cuba, it wasn't a model that you could easily lift and drop into the English-speaking Caribbean in that way, but we certainly adopted parts of it. I start there because I think out of that process, we've moved to a projectized regional approach that then tried to leverage the CARICOM movement, which was about the region coming together, recognizing the variabilities in capacity, size, and the congruence in some of the challenges to come together to try to tackle some of these challenges. And so one of the big projects behind that was called the Pan-Caribbean Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Project. That project, in the 80s, really was looking at a couple of things, looking at addressing, strengthening hazard analysis capabilities within the region, looking at prediction and warnings, looking at capacities for prevention and mitigation, the whole works, research, planning, preparedness, training, but also capacity development for responding to crisis within the Caribbean region. Right? So here is now the genesis of the region beginning to come together to find solutions to solve its own problems. And that project was wrapping up at the end of the 80s. And one of the recommendations was to establish an institutional mechanism which was very much tied to the CARICOM movement that would remain to carry this agenda forward. Now, what came out of that was an organization called SEDERA. That was not the objective. The objective was a much more comprehensive institution that was looking at all of the component parts that I talked about, which included a very big portfolio on doing humanitarian response for the region, the Caribbean region. But the region's leadership sought to go the route of establishing initially this response architecture because it was seen as being the primary need at the time. So that's the sort of backdrop that that took us there. Now, behind this, certainly we recognize that a region that had certain capacities installed related to or colonial past. So the military installations that were part of many of these islands, whether big, small, whether appropriately equipped, were present and were seen as part of this instrument around how the region could address some of these issues. And the region set about certainly expressing itself in different spaces, whether it was hurricane impacts, whether it was volcanic eruptions, whether these were of a security nature, deploying these assets into the space to be able to provide the types of support. Of course, throughout that journey, as you well know, I mean, many of the regions became, in the 60s, 70s, and later on in the 80s, became a little bit more independent and sought to chart its own way. And with that, responsibilities for, resourcing, many of these infrastructure that was put in place from the colonial past and which were now becoming institutions being applied into this broader agenda around how we deliver security within the region and security in its broader sense, in the human security sense. But with that, certain challenges were being faced. And these challenges, to name a few, would be one, political will and political support. So even though CARICOM would have established this mechanism, the political will and political support to keep faith and to keep investing into this institutional system that was emerging was one that struggled. Second was the relationship with, I would say, the partnerships with other parts of the wider Caribbean region, the ARC, which included Latin America, Central America, and the engagement there, which was facing its own, I would say, geopolitical challenges, issues of culture, language, and so forth and so on. Recognizing again that many Caribbean nationals had migrated to the coastline of many of those Central American and near South American shores, and therefore creating that sort of platform for greater collaboration within that space. One that we struggled to capitalize on, despite some of the institutional systems that were set up around forging greater ties between the Caribbean and the greater Latin American area. Another one would have been the sort of financing, getting financing into these emerging institutional systems and ensuring that they were being built, being kept fit for purpose to meet the vision that was laid out in the sort of whether it was a CARICOM document or whether it was the broader ACS, Association of Caribbean States, around these particular issues. And then there was the issue of competition, right? I mean, and more so on a smaller scale in terms of some of these military institutions and their struggle to exert their own presence, dominance within that Caribbean near shore around who was better able to respond to these issues rather than keeping faith with this idea around solidarity and coming together to deal with the challenges. And that, of course, certainly would have faced, I would say, catalytic issues from which larger nations they were well aligned with and was willing to support their efforts into the space itself. And then the other challenge I think that we would come up against was the multilateral system and the role they saw themselves playing in this global space, right? Where the multilateral system believed, and certainly there was reason for this, that they had a major role to play in supporting governments who would face these particular challenges, deploying their humanitarian mechanisms in support of these countries. Now, inherent within that challenge was a tendency, I think, to engage under the pretext that this was, one, providing support, but two, building the institutional systems within these regions. But that didn't always play out in the theater of operations. It became a very heavy external architecture, landed upon many of these national systems, and which tamped down, I would say, on their capabilities and their efforts to express themselves, right? And this was certainly being supported by the way the multilateral system itself was financed at the time, right? The big donors were keen to ensure that the multilateral system was so-called delivering. But I think as time progressed, there was, and hence my title, there was this sense that these regional systems, whether you look at it from the lens of the Caribbean or what was happening in some of the other countries, perhaps supported by some of the exercises that were happening in the region, sponsored by the US and others, began to see themselves emerging and being institutional systems that required the sort of attention and the sort of freedom to begin to express itself more into that space. And in CARICOM, one of the institutional system that was established was called the regional response mechanism. Right? And the regional response mechanism was really established around, I would say, some very clear tenets or principles. One of the main principles was that a region such as CARICOM, with its institutional system, should never be seen as being marginalized in responding to the needs of its citizens, when these crises occur. It was seen not only as an operational issue, but also as a political issue, as you can well imagine. And so, in that regard, there were some very clear tenets. One which was that there needed to be a primary focus, provide the member states of CARICOM with support to limit the impact of these events, to prioritize the ability to act early and to assist these participating states in preventing the worst from becoming a reality when these events occurred, to ensure that there was on hand earmarked resources that could culturally appropriate support these participating states with their needs, and that the participating states of CARICOM would always retain control of this particular response and the response priorities and operations, even when provided with additional resources from the international community. So these were, I think, some of the key principles that the region held near and dear, And in delivering on this, certainly there was this view that the nearshore partners within the Latin American and Caribbean region would be a space of engagement for this. In fact, I spoke about the Pan-Caribbean project, which then became SEDERA. One of the main pillars of that was for greater engagement with the French territories, which was seen as part of the Caribbean, even though they were French. So there was a question around forging greater relationships with the French territories, with the Dutch territories, and of course with the Latin American neighbors, to be able to bring this capacity and scale as per the case required it. And we saw some of this emerging, with events in hurricane events in Jamaica, with issues in Haiti, from a security point of view, also from a seismic point of view, where we saw this expression of the wider regional solidarity and trying to address the needs of near members, regardless of some of the geopolitical and cultural differences that existed. Venezuela, Dominican Republic, and so forth and so on, and others really trying to step into that space. So, with that and with the growing need to express this improved capacity, I think more and more oxygen was being pumped into that space to be appreciated. But we were still facing, I think, in the region, this tendency for the international community to, again, express itself. And in expressing itself, it was tamping down on efforts of the region to be able to really build its own capacity, chart its way, and to take that sort of leadership role in delivering the humanitarian support to its members according to the principles that I've outlined in my previous statement. But opportunities, I think, have emerged, which are leading to this journey back to the overall vision. One of the opportunities is really on the other side of threats. There are opportunities. So this world filled with crisis, where more and more crises are happening in the world, which is straining the international institutions' ability, international mechanisms' ability to be able to respond to all of these, both in terms of human resources and financial resources, presents an opportunity for this liberation of these regional capabilities that we are seeing trying to rise up and to demonstrate its capabilities. The declining financing, which is linked to what we were saying, right? Now, the donor governments are themselves looking inward with their own security threats, with their own shifting more to nationalist perspectives. It is leading more and more to a declining resource envelope into this particular space, and potentially also a result of what's happening in the global international framework, where with every issue, there's a global framework, and which dictates how the financing envelope goes, right? And that is leading itself to, again, a reduction in the envelope for dealing with the humanitarian crisis. It's providing, I think, an opportunity for the region to start to look at the region and how it supports itself in this particular context. And then there are questions around the effectiveness of multilateralism, which is looming in the background. Is the multilateral system still effective? Has it delivered on its promise? We can go back to the when it was created, looking at it from the humanitarian lens. You can go back to the World Humanitarian Summit and what came out of it, and the need to look at localization and strengthen the capacities to deliver on localization. I think all of these are providing an opportunity for us to re-engage on this vision around how the region can then support itself in this particular journey. So my reflection here is that as the world faces these particular challenges, as we see efforts to strengthen these regional institutional systems being challenged by more of a preference for donors to resource more and more the sort of multilateral system. Within that, I think there is now a chance for the region, if it can come together, to really free itself from this dependency, because it is a dependency. You know, because we have not we've not kept faith with the vision and invested in this sort of, not at the level of CARICOM, but also not at the level of the ACS, a system that is able to leverage the resources that are available to it to be able to deploy this to the people, given the principles I outlined: the need for speed, the need to ensure that there is leadership leveraged, or should I say leadership bestowed into the hands of the country that's affected and the people within the region that's affected. I think there's now an opportunity, and I outline what are the signs of change that I think presents that opportunity for the region to begin to think differently about itself, to really examine what are the resourcing windows that are available to it, to examine the opportunities that are being presented by the fact that many of the donors who would have supported the sort of external responses are now supporting investments that are building capacities of these regional spaces. But what will come out of it will very much depend on whether the regional institutions, and not just the institutions themselves, but the political leaders behind these particular institutions, are willing to seize that moment and that opportunity, and to loosen, I would say, the cord a little bit from our dependency on only thinking that help can come from outside of this region. You know, the LAC region or the Caribbean region. Help does exist within the region, but it requires a sort of political support and political capital to leverage it, to be able to deploy. So I'll stop there, Ricardo. I don't know if I've used up all of the time, but I wanted to kind of open up a little bit to tease the mind somewhat, you know, just to see, you know, what are the thoughts on this issue. I'm happy to take questions as we enliven the discussions and the debate around this particular issue.
Thank you, Ronald. Alex, can you please put the audio to Rodrigo as well? Before I give the space to Rodrigo, I mean, you are talking a very fascinating story, no? About the regional initiatives and even the regional autonomy, no? To think, to deal, to manage, and to govern problems, no? From the same people, no.
Absolutely.
Different from multilateralism, different from like the typical humanitarian that come from the north and all that, and especially in a regional that is so historical structured, no, by slave trade, by the plantation system, no, by this relation between abandonment, no, and extractivism, thinking about tourism and all that, no. So it's very interesting to see that, to recognize, to make visible that, look, we have a story of a regional initiative to think about disasters in a different way, no?
Yeah.
I just want to, of course, this is always a tricky question, no? If you can give us like some insight, like a general idea about the type of key thinking, no, of key thoughts that this local regional initiative we're having, no, to say, for thinking about disasters in a particular Caribbean way. More or less, my question would be like, is there like a Caribbean way of thinking about disasters? What will be the difference? What will be the assets? What will be the characteristics of that way of thinking?
No, I think, look, I think the Caribbean way of thinking about disaster risk reduction is it's not only a shared approach or principle that exists within the Caribbean. I think the Latin American region has been one, and Latin America and the Caribbean, let me add the C, because sometimes by saying Latin America, we forget that the Caribbean is part of that, right? We have been at the forefront, I would say. That region has been at the forefront of many of these issues, having to grapple with them. Many of the concepts and ideas around how disaster risk is to be treated emerged in that region, both within the Caribbean and in Latin America, with Lared and others who were thinkers. At the time, you could have also unearthed many publications from the OAS in the early days that really demonstrated the thinking around these issues. And so there is a shared conceptual approach that spans Latin America and the Caribbean on this particular issue. But in the Caribbean itself, they've managed to establish what is called a regional response mechanism. And that mechanism is one of a kind. At the time it has been established and still remains one of a kind. I know there are other regions in the world which are trying to replicate this. And in fact, in Latin America, or should I say in Central America, Seperdinac, who had a relationship with CARICOM on some of these issues around disasters at the time, was seeking to replicate that similar model that was happening in the Caribbean around how it managed responses in the Latin American context. Now, I think there was an opportunity, or is an opportunity, for maybe even greater success because of the level of assets that they hold that could easily be brought into delivering on this vision I talked about, right? This vision of being able to deploy persons who had similar cultural attenuation, had the sort of resources that could move quickly along that peninsula to provide support to any one of its members, right? It had military installations that were larger, that had more equipment, that could move. Because one of the big challenge in a region like ours was dedicated asset to move people and resources in and among the islands to provide that support, that humanitarian support. In the case of Latin America, they didn't have necessarily that challenge, right? They had more assets at their disposal. And some of those assets, as I said to you before, were even deployed to support some of the Caribbean responses. So the regional response mechanism is one of the things I would put to you in terms of your question, enshrined in the broader regional strategy around how it managed risk, but looking now at the sort of reactive risk management piece, where they designed an infrastructure that was supposed to bring together the regional capabilities and assets, whether it was military, whether it was police, whether it was health service providers, whether it was volunteers, to provide a range of support systems. It also thought through quite clearly how it would facilitate the harmonization and coordination of the donor community in the region in support of this particular effort, as well as plug in the disciplined forces that were not necessarily from within the region, but had an interest in the region, right? And there's a whole acronym for how they saw that operating in what is called I will come back to the name. It's a coordinating mechanism for the military. It will come back to me. My brain is jumping all over the place at the time, but it really provided an opportunity. And we got to try out some of these things where the UK, Canadian, Dutch, French, and US military would operate in a space where they would understand the needs from the region and try to plug those gaps. Those gaps being, airlift support, ocean transportation support, and so forth and so on, right? Given the gaps that exist in the region in that regard. So that's one of the things I would put on the table in response to your question. It had elements that looked at deploying people to provide operational support to a government when their staff would have been impacted, stretched. They provided similar support to what you would see in the UN OCHA for coordination processes, for assessment processes. It brought the medical personnel, doctors, nurses, etc., to be deployed. Doctors and nurses would have been trained and understood the region's needs to be deployed. A battalion to look at engineering needs, a group of police officers who would have been deployed into theater to help with the security demands of the event. So it was all there. The challenge was always, how do we get resources to keep this mechanism resourced and to enhance it and to keep it fit for purpose as we move forward into the future. And I think that's where it struggled, right? It struggled from accessing resources from the governments who created it and who were wavering between where to spend. And this is taking us back to our earlier discussion, right? Debt, the whole debt that was created coming out of the post-colonial period, which became a burden as these governments developed. And the question around, where do I spend the limited resources we have given the fiscal space? Do we spend it on investing in these regional mechanisms, which we know are important, but at the same time, we have the immediate demands of our citizens for certain other, public goods, right? And then the question is, what could we access from the development and humanitarian global financing mechanism, which were more interested in funding the international mechanism to operate in that space? And you saw it play out, right? I mean, when an event happened, what quantum of resources or financial resources were available to the region and where the share of it went. Good. And this could have been, viewed as a share driven by a lack of confidence in whether the regional system had the capabilities and capacities, whereas confidence was established or bestowed on the international system because of how it is seen as being designed and supported and resourced and governed. So I think, these are some of the tensions that played out over the last, I would say, 20, 30 years. But as I said to you, as we face more challenges in the world, I think there's room opening for us to rethink this a little bit. But the region has to step in and to engage in the opportunities that are being presented to it for this, right? I mean, can OCHA continue to stretch its resources to be in regions where capacities are growing, like Latin America and the Caribbean? Should they invest in capacity building in those regions so that it can get on with the business of dealing with those events that are not necessarily of I would say, a nature that it overwhelms the entire region, but requires response, while it focuses on some of the bigger issues that are happening in Africa and the Middle East. These are things that are actually playing out in the theater of operation, and we need to take stock of it and to see it as a window of opportunity for Latin America and the Caribbean and other such regions to strengthen its capabilities, to take on that role, to free themselves of a total dependency. Not that international support is not going to be needed, but we clearly can begin to look at what is a national disaster requiring external support, and that external support can come from the near region, CARICOM. What is a regional disaster, i.e. one that is too much for CARICOM to be able to manage on its own resources, and which it can then, through the cooperative arrangements with the ACS, draw on resources from other neighbors, versus what then becomes an international scale event, which outstrips the capabilities that are available within that region and requires more external investments or external assets to come in to support it. That's the kind of thinking we need to begin to discipline into that process, which gives everybody a stake to play, but allows us to be a little bit more efficient and effective but also for, we talk about development for these regions that are seeking to develop themselves, to be able to demonstrate the capabilities to govern these types of humanitarian issues that face them from time to time. I hope I answered your question, Mika.
Just give us more thing to more fish to think. I mean, really, so much to think about this. I don't know, Alex, can you give us please the microphone to Rodrigo? I know he wants to talk so much. Okay, Rodrigo, you're on. So you can take it if you can, if you want to say something, no? Or we just continue having here a conversation. Rod.
Yeah, no, I can present some reflections. Thanks. First of all, thanks so much, Ronald. Definitely, there's a lot to think about dependency. It's like a rethinking about the dependency theories from the angle of disasters and colonialism. Um, and interesting enough, as you know, we are inviting you to talk here because the topic of the Humanitarian Observatory this year is no natural disasters and this campaign that we have. And I think maybe in the no natural disasters approach is also a way out of dependency. And let me explain a little bit how I might need to close the circle based on what you're saying. First of all, I agree with you there is a big dependency, especially on the financial aspects of the response. But I think also one way out is to start realizing that there is a level of independency or uniqueness in disaster, in humanitarian action in the region. And this is also something really important to start recognizing. Something that we spoke in the first year of the observatory is that humanitarian action in the region is quite different than in Africa or in Asia. In particularly because our governments in Latin America, with all its failures, are much more strong. And that means that even the big organizations, they need to negotiate with them. I mean, you cannot just say, hey, we follow the sphere standards, and this is what we do. The government says, sorry, in this country, we do it in this way, and you follow these rules or goodbye. So there is a level of independency that we already retain, that we already have, that we can build upon, and also in our way of acting. Also because of the topics, we don't face, fortunately, in the region, these massive, big civil wars. I mean, we have huge governmental crises, like Venezuela, delinquency, organized crime, but we don't have, fortunately, the big situation that we have in other places of the world. And that means that humanitarian action in our region, it's different, you don't need to deal with that type of conflict.
Yes.
And in that means also we work at a different level. A lot of humanitarian actors in our region are really localized. They work in the long impact of, drug control territories, the long impact of poverty, the long impact of, Haiti and others. So
Yes.
our level is different. Our governance spaces are different and our topics are different. And that means that we already have some level of independency or uniqueness that already distance us from the international humanitarian system, but also having forcing humanitarian international actors and agendas to adapt to our region. So I think one way out is start recognizing that we are already doing it differently. We are using the same shirt, the same branding, but doing it completely different. I mean, no one in the region can operate exactly than in other places. And even myself, I have seen myself when I was more a practitioner, what I can do in other regions is completely different what I can do in Latin America in that sense. And why I'm trying to say that, why I say that why no natural disasters also might be one way of out of dependency, particularly economical one, is that the most expensive aspect of disasters is responding to them in situ, reacting to them. We know the power of reducing the risk of disasters and preventing them from happening. And this also relates with developmental issues. We know that disasters are not natural. Disasters are the result of social political conditions. And as many have said, even from the 70s, disasters are the result of failure in development. It's failed development. It's not an external thing that can. And in that sense, maybe the way out from the dependency is to really understand that the region needs to invest much more in disaster risk reduction. But that only will happen when we understand that disasters are not external and not something that just happen out there and come to us. That disasters are something that we are creating in the region. It's our inequalities, it's our poverty. And that means that we can bring different resources, not only the emergency resources. I mean, in that sense, the disaster agenda disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management agenda in the region might also be much strongly linked with developmental agendas, long-term investment by different banks, for example, because in our region, it's possible to invest long-term in these kind of things, where many World Bank will not be investing in countries that are much more volatile in terms of conflict things. So there is also a way of getting out of the dependency just by understanding disasters not as an emergency, but as a long-term crawling problem that we have. So in that sense, the non-natural disasters opens the door of how do we do it. Now I'm gonna present a critical perspective to my own point of view. That is that why international cooperation and bilateralism works in the region when it comes to big disasters, because of the idea of solidarity, because of the idea that we are all affected by disasters and it's not the fault of the government. If we really take seriously the idea of disasters are not natural, we know that every disaster is happening because there is a governance failure and it's because there is a government responsible.
Yeah.
So now I'm kind of stepping on my own tail. So no natural disaster is a way out, but the risk of it is that people will start thinking, I don't need to be, I don't need to have solidarity with them because it's not poor people, victims that are affected. This is happening because they are not doing what they should be doing. Why I would be giving money and supporting a government that failed and is producing the same problem?
Yeah.
So I know that I'm bringing my own conundrum to my own perspective. So I think this is one of the way out, but also we need to do it in a proper way that doesn't bite us back.
No, I think these are, I mean, if I may, Rodrigo, I don't want to interrupt your.
No. This is a conversation, and I also invite everyone else.
I want to come in there because I share the same view as you do on the social and political construct of these crises we see, particularly in our region, right? I mean, it is I often say that risk is a byproduct of development. You can't pursue your development objectives without creating risk, and risk is essentially the sort of fuel on which the triggers act. The triggers being the sort of natural events or man-made events which are themselves exploiting the risk we're creating through development. Risks such as vulnerability, marginalization, inequality, etc., right? Governance weaknesses, failure to invest in strong institutional systems. And like you, I do believe if we're able to tackle these things better, we free up resources because, as long as we're pursuing a development objective, you will still have the potential for a trigger to act on those weak areas in the development process. But you will be able to free up resources to invest in the type of institutional system that can manage less of a load when those impacts occurs, right? When the trigger meets the risk variable. But to your point, which I think is a very, very important point to reflect on, because as we pursue this idea of no natural disasters, and we make the argument for liberating certainly Latin America and the Caribbean from this dependency, we are in fact indeed creating questions, as you say. Why should there be solidarity? The system that is built on solidarity now comes under this scrutiny and challenges. If you are messing up your yard, why am I supposed to help bail you out of the mess you're creating in your own space? And one response to that could be the journey back is not overnight. It's not overnight, and I think even in that regard, the shared principles remain. The shared principles that we're a region that share common issues, common challenges, those remain. Our message needs to be that, regardless of whether you have invested or you've made the right types of governance decisions, doesn't mean you won't get impacted and have negative consequences of those impacts, right? I think that's where we start to try to create that balance in the message. Yes, we have a responsibility as governments, as people, in what we do at home. But even in pursuing those responsible practices does not exempt us from the potential for there to be a calamity, which is that interaction between the natural or man-made event and risk, which is, as I said before, a byproduct of our development pursuit.
Yeah.
Right? It won't go away. It is still going to remain. It's really trying to find that balance around how we manage risk within that space. That becomes the conversation we need to have with our populace, that managing that risk is all of us. It's not about a government that is culpable. It's not about a citizenry who has acted inappropriately in terms of their own practices in their own spaces. It's about how we collectively change the spaces we live in, how we collectively leverage our resources, that we can collectively pursue those development aspirations and those, I would say, shared public goods around prosperity. Because if we don't do it well, and if we don't encourage and support the process being done well next door, then at some point it will impact us in the future. I think that's the kind of conversation, but you're so right. I think the challenge for us is going to be able to get that communication balance right.
Yeah, and there are ways of doing it. I mean, I just sharing one paper from Bale already in the 75, and then there is a discussion from Bisner and others. And even in the region, we have a really strong movement. I mean, La Red, and probably some of you know, they have been, discussing this kind of things for forever, and Alan and many others, of how do we move forward. I mean, the question is, that's, maybe I'm moving to another, this is I just shared the link of the La Red. The main question for me, and it's almost like an academic endeavor, is how do we politicize without create conflicts? How do we assume that disasters are political and social without start creating the finger pointing game? How do we understand that it's not one's responsible, but it's everyone's responsibility, and how can this will affect everyone? Because disasters, sometimes they respect borders, but the vast majority of time they don't. Yeah. I don't want to colonize the topic, because also we have other people that maybe want to ask questions.
Sure.
But sorry, you want to say something, Ronald?
Absolutely. No. I'm happy to hear from any other colleagues who would like to perhaps, share some reflections as perhaps we wait for them to weigh in. One of the things, and I think the Lared crew would have been part of this. I mean, at some point in my own genesis, there was this view called, postulated the politics of disasters, right? It's about choices, and it's about sometimes winners and losers. It's sometimes how limited resources, especially given the journey that many of the countries within our region have had to take, right? Journeys out of colonization and in pursuing their development. There are choices that have been made in that journey that we now have to deal with the consequences of. And that's political from time to time, right? So it's the reality is, as you say, what language we use to communicate and to ensure that there is an understanding that there is a political economy, right, around these issues. And there are potentials for trade-offs. What do those trade-offs mean in the pursuit of trying to right the ship and to get us on the pathway to the sort of transformational change we want to see? It's a complex issue. It's an issue I think that is, we're capable of tackling in a sort of regional context, but it starts with an appreciation of the fact that we can be masters to some degree of our destiny in that, right? Going back to your point about no natural disasters, if we take that point, then it puts power back into the hands of the local communities, the governments, the populace, the region. That's our development choices. And if we can think about it differently, we can develop differently. It brings me back to, as we wait for colleagues who may want to come in, this question around whose vision of development is being pursued in that space, right? Because that's also part of the issue.
Which development and for whom?
Correct. It's part of the issue, right? In terms of, are we pursuing a development framework that's probably not fit for the spaces we occupy? I mean, should development in the Caribbean look the same as it should look in the South American continent? Should it look the same as in the North American continent? Are there limitations to what development could look like? And in all its facets, I'm talking about the environment, infrastructure, social, and so forth and so on. So, these are some of the issues that are at play.
Yeah.
And we think we extract the humanitarian conversation from that, but it's very much central to that, right? Because it's really about, what is then the remaining elements that we've not been able to secure through our risk reduction agenda that we now have to deal with. And the way we pursue development speaks to what will be the caseload, let's say, of the humanitarian response when we face those moments when you have that interruption, because we can't wipe away these triggers. They will come. The natural triggers will come.
Yeah.
It's what we do to ensure that the scale and scope of these events are within the realm of our management, and therefore, again, going back to the provocation, making it able for us to free ourselves from this dependence on always having to seek external support. Right? We can get there if we take this view that you're postulating and that we're discussing.
But maybe, I mean, what you're saying triggers to me another thought, that we need to lose the dependency not only on external support and external actors, we also need to lose dependency of our own ways of thinking and developing. So we need to lose our own dependency of our way of thinking, that's, I mean, as I wrote in the chat, it's DRR, so disaster risk reduction, again, the currents of DRC, so disaster risk creation. So we also need to lose dependency from, we are so dependent of one way of developing that we don't see other ways possible of developing, but we don't see other ways, our ways different of developing. We're going to keep creating the same disasters that we're trying to fight on the wild side.
Absolutely.
So it's an internal, external loosening of dependency process, which is, I think internally is much more difficult. I mean, all of us, when you are struggling with personal things, you know how difficult it is to change your mindset. Imagine that for governance.
Absolutely. And that is also a worthy political conversation to have, right? I mean, I think we have to start there with this engagement, reflection, discussion, socialization. It's not an overnight transformation, but it starts with all parts of the system engaging that question. What should be our own model of development, and to determine that, and to then ensure that we can we can, as you say, see a different way of approaching that that advancements toward prosperity.
Definitely.
Yes, please do come in.
No, sorry, this is just fascinating. I don't want to talk about that. I really want to say, if someone has a question, please go. I mean, when I am listening to you, Ron, I'm thinking about perhaps another question that is really clear for these regional initiatives, is that actually the whole idea of the triple nexus and all that, I mean, these are things that have already been thought and been happening a long time ago, I think here about of course, I sent you my article on San Andres and Providence Island, about the whole reconstruction of Yota, of the islands and all this after Yota. Yesterday, there was a big scandal about how much of the resources, were channeled through the political party of the government, So there's a lot of scandals also about the way in which the firms, more or less the idea of the disaster capitalism, with many firms and contractors were putting a lot of money over there, no. But I think that a key here, different from that, I think a key conversation here is something that we in the project with Rodrigo Mantea, really think like is the idea of like thinking here, thinking of construction, thinking of this as an arena of dispute. No, where different actors come together, no, to negotiate, to mediate, and actually to talk about difference, no. And I think that one of the really interesting things that happen in the Caribbean, also in Andes and Prophet Island, is a very strong civil society. No,
Yeah.
the very strong civil society, very much influenced by the church. I mean, with the people that we're talking in Providence Island, on that they really we're talking about the Christian ethic, no, that come from this evangelical baptism movements and all that. So I want to, if you want to say something about the civil society, about the strong civil society, because not so much, not only about governments, but also about the really important like social leaders, grassroots activities and all this. That thing is very strong, and I think it's very crucial for understanding the arena of dispute, no, between the state, the multilateralism, and also the local initiatives like coming from the civil society. So I just want to give you some space about the very strong, fascinate, and that also has to do with Rod. I mean, I think that one of the characteristics of Latin America and the Caribbean region is a very strong civil society, very mature, very acute. I mean, from La Red, they were talking in the 70s and 80s, talking about the decolonization of the humanitarian and of this. So, I mean, we have very rich conversation come from the civil society again. So, and very also influenced by the church and the religious domain and all this. So I don't want to know, if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think, again, it could very well be very much linked and tied to the not just the struggles the region has faced with having to cope with these challenges and really seeking innovative solutions out of them, which has led to the emergence of these civil society groups who themselves are also very much active in the communities to try to bring community-based solutions and to bring voice to the challenges. And I think that speaks volumes to a governance system that provides the space or opportunities for good governance, where different voices of a society can be elevated on some of these issues. And this is where the civil society groups, not just in terms of the church, but also some of those groups which have emerged from the engagement of academics on these issues. Some of them have served in institutions and on retirement, have taken on the responsibility of this continued service through the civil society type organizations, which are again continuing to point to these challenges. And I think, as I was saying, I think that's one thing that some parts of the world, Latin America and the Caribbean being such, has as a not necessarily unique, but where there is strength in continuing to echo these issues. The recent climate conversations, where the governments are speaking to the need for loss and damage financing to be direct access. You have on the next side of that, the civil society calling for transparency in the processes around how these conversations are happening. So they are becoming the soul and the conscience of both governments at home, but also governments more broadly on some of these issues. And as you said, going back to the 70s, but becoming more and more stronger campaigners for how we treat these issues. My biggest concern really is how sort of global institutional system can sometimes what's the word I'm looking force itself on the sort of national space in such a way that it doesn't allow the sort of independence of thought those national spaces, right? It becomes the national spaces start to mimic sort of global institutional systems and financial systems, and really not being independent enough to really create the sort of systemic interlinkages that are necessary for them to free themselves from these particular challenges. That's the one fear, one concern, because even as civil society is growing, the civil society themselves are amassing and engaging in these global spaces of discourse, and run the risk sometimes of mimicking some of the sort of global groupthink on these issues, and not leveraging again their independent thought that has led them to challenge some of the status quo around this issue, and to push the boundaries for us to be different in terms of how we manage disasters, how we think about development, how we engage local actors and local institutions in the process, such that you have true development, which is founded on these local systems.
Well, Ron, thank you very much. Here is Gustavo Gutierrez, and he just put in the chat this question: thinking about tourism, how can we conceive development when some economies are constructed around systems of exploitation in the global south? That's a fascinating question to answer in 2 minutes.
It's a tremendously fascinating question, and probably is the subject of a thesis. One of the upcoming events we're having is the Latin American and Caribbean Development Ministers Forum, which is coming up, I think, in Barbados. And one of the things, there is a side event that is actually also looking at this issue, right, around reimagining tourism in the context of the exposure that the region faces, but two, the sense that it is sometimes seen as a space of extractivism and exploitation. What could this new model look like, right? Is it in terms of going for mass, or going for a value-based, community style, high-end type approach? What's the mix? So I think it's a very important conversation to engage in. I don't have the immediate answer to it, but it's certainly something that I think goes back to this question around, do we survive individually, or do we survive collectively? And how does that collective survival depend on as a system, seeing ourselves as a system, and ensuring that the system is distributing its resources and its opportunities and its prosperity within that system.
And just want to notice that you used the metaphor of the ship, no?
Yeah.
As a ship, that we're
Yeah.
in a ship, all of us, no?
Yeah.
Of course, ships are very famous in the Caribbean, no? from the slave ship, no, to the luxury, ship as well, no. So of course we have a conversation of what type of ship we are here, no. Do we all fit in the same ship, no? Or what happens when hurricanes are coming and the ship is there, no? You know that during the slave ships, one of the practices was actually to throw slaves, no? So that the ship will take out the weight and all this, no? So I mean, this is a fascinating talk. We can continue talking so much about this, no? Because I think you really point out at crucial things about this. I mean, managing risk has to do with a political economy, but also has to do about epistemology, about recognizing that the production of knowledge, local production of knowledge, is very important here, no?
Yeah.
Which is not only about contextualization, no, but it's actually about a radical contextualization, no? A radical contextualization means that it's not only that we invite all of you to my party, no, but that we all are subject and production of knowledge, no? And it really gives us a sense about how the region, no, is at the front line of thinking differently about risks and disaster of this. So Ron, I really want to thank you so much about this, no? I think really want to, we're close here, but I think we're open new conversations and new ideas about really how the region, and this is not only an idea about patriotism and all this, but it's actually about recognizing that the region has been a crucial laboratory, for thinking differently about development, about humanitarian, and about peace reconstruction and all this, So thank you much, Ron, for this. I know that we have lots of things to say, but we have the future, and we will continue having conversations about this, So Ron, Rod, I don't know if you want to say something, but for me, thank you, Ron. It's always a pleasure, and for sure I want to be in the same ship with you, well, for traveling through the Caribbean. Thank you much, Ron.
Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to join you and to just share with you and just to have this conversation, reflecting a little bit, and looking at not just the challenges but the opportunities that are emerging.
Great.
Until next time. Cheers.
Okay.
And
see you next time.
Yes.
Thanks so much. See you. Thanks so much, Ricardo, also for hosting.
Okay.
Take care. Bye bye.